I want to welcome everybody back. I can't hear my translator. Okay, I've swapped translator. Sorry about that. So in our last presentation, we were discussing the question about Sabbath keeping and about our nature. Two vital components of our prophetic message. So my understanding is it has always been that we will continue to keep Sabbath week after week through eternity. The Bible doesn't speak about the 1,000 years in heaven and how that operates. Because obviously we're not here on this earth and we don't have the rotation of the earth around the sun, etc. But there's no indication that we will stop keeping Sabbath then. So putting that aside, we spoke about whether or not we are going to be real human beings in eternity. Questioner asked, are we going to stop being humans in the questioner's words because we become fully God's counterparts? And in this presentation, in this study, we have not defined the word counterpart. But it's a concept that I have discussed in the past and we all have a working knowledge of. And it can have various connotations depending upon the context or the point that a person wants to make. It has this idea of completeness. And it's used in that context in the framework of the creation of humanity. In the book of Genesis, when those two beings are created, they become counterparts of one another. But our focus in the last study was about us and God. Discussing our relationship with the Godhead. I hope you were able to look through the Bible verses and the Spirit of Prophecy quotes. Either during the presentation or during the break that followed. There are many passages that deal with this subject, particularly in the spirit of prophecy, and especially in the work of Jones and Wagner. And we know that this is important in the passage that we were focusing upon, 2 Peter 1:4. It talks about this promise but we all know in the framework of Jones and Wagner's writings, terminology such as righteousness by faith or justification by faith is used. And the reason why this becomes significant, why these two subjects are related, the two subjects being the Sabbath and the ministry and mission of those two men, is because Ellen White ties them together. I hope you all recall, in case you've forgotten, I'll give you just one reference. This is taken from the book Evangelism, page 190, paragraph 3. It's on the forum. I haven't developed this thought in the recent past, but we spoke about Ellen White's writings in the book Early Writings. When she speaks about the sins of Babylon. And the way I, if not phrased it, the way I intimated, this apparent tension, or maybe you might consider a discrepancy, between God's handwriting, the chart, and the law of the land, what was happening in society at that time. Is the subject about the Sabbath, or is it about slavery? So we left that study there, and I didn't take the opportunity or the time to develop it further. And I'm not planning to do that now. But what I do want to do, without giving context, is to tie the two portions of this singular question together. The Sabbath and our human nature. Because it's The question was by one person, and this dual question has been asked many times before. And the classic place that we find this question asked and addressed in the context that I've given to you is in 1890. So there may be a jump of logic, but for the purposes of this study, this conversation, I'm going to assert the following. That means I'm going to state as a fact the following. The message of the third angel, whoever the angel is directly connected to the Sunday law test. It's directly connected to the subject of the Sabbath. In 1890, everybody knows that. In this movement, we used to believe that. And I'm not sure what we think nowadays about this issue. But I'm not making that point. I'm confining it to the question. Sabbath and nature. And when I say nature, I mean of humans. So either you remember it as Sabbath and nature or Sabbath and humanity. And this question, the same question, is asked in 1890 and answered. And I'm suggesting at a surface level, you need to be able to connect this issue right back 40 years earlier to 1850. And if you prefer, we could go back to the phrase that we use, the 1888 message. And clock back 40 years, which brings you to 1848, which is a pivotal year in the history of Adventism. And the world, because of the turmoil that was occurring in Europe. And there are plenty of studies online that have been done by teachers in this movement that describe and discuss that history. But what I want us to see, the question that's related to the message of Jones and Wagner is tied back to the history of 1848 and 1850. And the wilderness period through which the church travels in the intervening period. We know that Israel goes through the wilderness for 40 years. So you have a beginning and an ending. And we might put that on a line, but we can also put it as a circle, because the issues at the beginning become the issues at the end. And this is line upon line methodology, as we all know. So Ellen White's not going to use the phrase, and the questioner's not going to use the term Sabbath. Or Sunday. They're going to call it the third angel's message. This is a surface discussion. These are superficial definitions. There is much more depth to this subject. But simply stated, I'm saying the third angel's message is the message of the Sunday law, or it's a code word for Sabbath keeping. The Sabbath test. Because it's not a Sunday law test, it's a Sabbath test. And the word verity simply means truth. The truthfulness of what this statement means. Of what this concept or idea is. So they can become synonymous terms. Synonymous means you can exchange them. So the question that's being asked is that at the beginning of our 40-year wilderness wandering, we were very clear about what the issue was. Today, the we view that beginning journey quite differently. So the we in 1890 today becomes the them. Because we've come to a place where we separate ourselves from their ideology, even perhaps their methodology. But as a prophet of God, Ellen White sees her responsibility to remind people of a truth. To tie these two things together. Then, as now, as the questioner asked, we still like to separate what God has joined together. So, Ellen White is going to say the message of the Sabbath of the third angel is this, we'll describe what the this is, in truthfulness. Because people don't see it when they've come to the end of their journey. And the implication is they should have seen it at the beginning. Because when she responds to the question, she's going to infer, she's going to imply, of course. How come you didn't know that? And her answer, the way she gives it, is not stating something new. She states it as a repetition of a reality. That she has known about, that she has expected, and therefore has come as no surprise to her. Several have written to me asking if the message of justification by faith is the Sabbath message, is the third angel's message. She tells people in this magazine, I've answered those people in the following way. Yes, the subject or the message of justification by faith is the third angel's message in verity. The subject of justification by faith is, it's not related to, it's not connected to. There are not two institutions that need to be restored. It is the Sabbath message in truth. They have always been the same issue. The same subject. The Sabbath, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, is as real, is as necessary as our humanity. If you take one away, you destroy the other. If you compromise one, I don't say if you compromise in one, I say if you compromise one, you destroy the other. John says that there are many liars that walk upon the earth. Claiming that they love God, and the only God that exists, the only one that we know about, the only connection point that we have with God, except for those few people during that 3.5-year history, is the God that created the Sabbath. And John says, if you don't love your fellow humans, whilst claiming to have a connection to the Sabbath God, because that's the only reality that we have to connect ourselves to God, then you're a liar. Peter does this. Jones does this. Wagner does this. Ellen White does this. John does this. The first John does this. And Moses ties this together in the book of Genesis. By now you can see this is in fact a common theme through the plan of salvation. It caught people by surprise. Over 130 years ago, Ellen White answered their question succinctly, directly. And yet we're still asking the same question today. We have been constrained in how we are supposed to relate and deal with one another. You can't separate that from how we're supposed to deal with and relate to God. And the eminent opportunity that we have to relate and communicate with God is in, during, and through the Sabbath. In, during, and through the Sabbath. And this seems to be a reality that we have lost, a vision that we no longer seem to comprehend. So when we compare the verses and the passages that we have been discussing, and we can tie the Sabbath, our divinity, and our humanity all together, if at least some of us, if not all of us, have swallowed the red pill, then we should understand how to navigate through our current history. So when we speak explicitly, clearly about a change in the test, we need to be careful that we don't undo and throw away the Sabbath. Because in doing so, we end up dismantling and throwing away our inheritance. Not just our future inheritance, but the gift that we have actually been given today. To be partakers of the divine nature. And as we should have expected, right on time, this promise, its prophetic fulfillment, its political fulfillment, not its personal one, happened at the correct time. At the midnight cry, where it should have been, where we were offered not to throw away the Sabbath, but we were offered to understand our own humanity, which today we call the test of equality. Sometimes we use other terms, but they all coalesce around this subject that relates to our humanity. Now, I hope that we all understand that, if I can say it this way, the test, call it the great test if you want, call it the life and death message if you prefer, is not static. The principles don't change. The conditions are invariable. But the test changes. Now, a subject that we have not spoken about, I have not spoken about, and I don't intend to speak about it now, but I will sooner or later, relates to the great test. Because if I were to ask you, what is the great test? you shouldn't be able to answer me. You should respond with your own question, which is, it depends on what history you're talking about. Give the history, give the context. I'll tell you the great test. So if we go back to the very beginning and we look at things at a very superficial level, as we're apt to do, as we often do, our simplistic version was you just keep the seventh-day Sabbath, and whatever the pressure is, you hold on and you'll be saved. I won't say it's childish, but I think it's fair to say it's naive and immature. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. So if we go back to the Genesis story, and we consider the great test, seems to me that the great test is about what you are allowed to eat and what you're not allowed to eat. Now, you might want to spiritualize it and make it complicated and nuanced. Feel free to do that. But at its simple level, the test was you can eat this thing and you're not allowed to eat that thing. Eat the wrong thing and you will die. Now, the question that you need to ask yourself is that test the test that we're confronted with today? Because many of us think that it still is. That you are going to be tested on what you eat and drink. And I'm suggesting that that's a subject that we'll discuss in the future. And I don't think it's as straightforward as people imagine. So, understanding that the great test changes through history at our loud cry, us as in the priests, when we look at the cry that happened at midnight, we can see how the great test was refined and defined. And it was only a year or so before, if you're willing to see it this way, that the subject of our humanity was brought to the forefront in our movement. because at least in my mind, our humanity, its connection to divinity, the very subjects of the nature of humanity are all spheres or facets of the same subject. What today we call equality or radical feminism. So when Peter speaks about the lust that is in the world, this corruption that occurs through forbidden desires, that corruption is both at a social and individual level. And in Daniel 11, verse 41, during the Sunday law history, speaks about a group of people that escape it doesn't say escape the world. It says escapes the servitude and restrictions imposed upon them by the ideology, we might call it the culture, or the religion of the world, which is personified in those passages as the king of the north. So, in the context of our current understanding of the great test, what is the corruption that has permeated the world and the church through these forbidden desires? What I want to suggest, it's this idea of a patriarchal system. Patriarchy has corrupted the world. And the way it does that is by creating in the hearts and minds of individuals the desire to think and live to relate to others, to even relate to the world in a way that is forbidden. In a way that stands in opposition to the divinity of God. So when we speak about radical feminism, which is a secular term, when we speak about equality, what we're really doing is using secular terminology to describe a religious concept. Because before we began to use these secular terms, we used religious terms. As we're doing today. And what I want us to see is whether you ask Daniel, Jones, Wagner, or White, John, or Peter, and I can't remember if I said Daniel or not, but Daniel, they're all saying the same thing. And they're all using different phraseology or terminology to describe the experience that we are required to have. They use, if I can say it this way, biblical terminology, and we use secular terminology to describe the same experience. So I've asked in the past, tell me what you think a radical feminist organization or a radical feminist individual would think, how they would operate. Well, the first thing they need to do is accept these exceeding great and precious promises. Take heed of the great cry. Because that cry explains the lust that we have been engaging in. These desires which are forbidden. It's forbidden to control other humans. In thought, in word, or in action. And the thing is, this is not will worship. You can't force yourself to live this way. The only way you can truly experience radical feminism I would suggest, is not by observing human beings, not by reading articles, not by studying books. All those things are good and necessary. But the passage tells us it's only by partaking of the divine nature, because in an end time setting, that's what the test is. And that also defines what the lust is. And how we have become corrupted. We're not corrupted because we're building a tower. Although you see the same principles in that story as we're experiencing today. patriarchal system has corrupted us. Each of us. In our own individual experiences, but also as a society, culture, and religion. And the only way to escape this is by exchanging our humanity for God's divinity. It means we need to eat, in the terminology that we used to use back in the day, we need to eat the little book. We need to partake. We need to share in the divine nature that's being offered to us. Which then helps us to better understand the experience that Ezekiel went through. When God offered to Ezekiel to eat of the little book that was handed to him. It's not just about making him angry and preaching a message of doom and gloom to a lost people. It was that, but it's much more. It's the same principle as we have spoken about today. It's the symbology of Ezekiel being offered to become a partaker of the divine nature. And when that happened, when he ate, if we could say, the book of Daniel, it transformed him from desiring things that are forbidden to seeing and experiencing things as God views them. So when he begins to react and behave, it's not as a human being, because now he has partaken of divinity. And when we see his behavior, his experience, his thoughts, we know how God views the corruption of God's people. Who had corrupted themselves through lust. Not sex, not violence. It included them, but they were not the real issue. It was the control that comes along with the patriarchal system. And right there, thousands of years ago, that's what God wanted to show their people. Not just individually, but corporately. If you go to the story of David or Solomon, you see God trying to execute the same work. Desiring the same goal. And I'm suggesting that in order to pass the test today, in order to view those stories correctly, contextually, sympathetically, having sympathy for them and for God, then you need to eat the little book, which is not just the book of Daniel. It encapsulates the whole of inspiration, so that we can become the people God designed us to be. Let's pray.
Hebu tuombe.
Dear Lord, as we contemplate and meditate upon your word, whether it's through one of your inspired prophets or directly through the words of Jesus or a secular journalist today, help us to understand our work and our duty. That each of us will understand the sacred responsibility of dividing your word correctly. For if we do not do that, we will not only destroy ourselves, but if we are not careful, we have it within our grasp to destroy the plan of salvation. In Jesus' name, amen.